However you are and wherever you are, welcome, and join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal landmines and alien crossroads. This is Paranormal Now, and I'm your host, Alan B. Smith. My guest tonight, coming up in just 12 minutes, is author Larry Holcombe of the Presidents and UFOs, A Secret History from FDR to Obama. Stay tuned for that. But before that, we're going to take a little walk through time, beginning with Mike Wallace's interview with Marine Corps Naval Aviator Donald Keyhoe, astronomer Dr. J. Allen Hynek in 1977, President Barack Obama, President Jimmy Carter, and United States Air Force Intelligence Chief Major General John Sanford, and Donald Keyhoe in 1952, and Ronald Reagan.
Major Keyhoe, what would you like to see done about flying saucers that is not currently being done? What steps would you like to see taken?
I think the American people should write to their congressman and insist that open hearings be held by the Senate Committee on the Permanent Committee on Government Operations, which has been looking into this for 6 months.
An Air Force spokesman told us this last week. He said members of the Senate subcommittee have talked with us already, and they have shown no interest in conducting any hearings on this issue.
I talked with the chief investigator within the last 2 weeks. I gave him a lot of information, and I gave him data on one case where an airliner was sent to chase one of these things, and the passengers kept in ignorance of it at that time. That involves 2 government agencies beside the Air Force, which has refused to release the report. Mm-hmm. And I'll say this: if the committee were to get Ruppelt, Major Fournet, several colonels who were on that time, Major General Garland, who was on the project, it would be a big revelation, because the Air Force is simply treating the American people like children. They don't trust them with the facts.
You know, here's an interesting question, Major. The United States and Russia have started sending satellites into the sky, and we may be hitting the moon with a rocket soon, possibly Mars. You believe that creatures from outer space have space stations on Mars. What's going to happen when we start firing rockets at the moon or at Mars?
That question's already been brought up. We expect to have a base on the moon within the next 5 years. It's possible that there is a base on there. I don't say there was any proof of it.
Is it possible we're going to start an interplanetary war when we start sending our rockets to the moon and to Mars?
In 1935, General Douglas MacArthur said the next war would be an interplanetary war, and we'd have to unite against people from other planets.
One last question, Major Keyhoe. Have you ever seen a flying saucer?
I've seen them tracked on radar, but I take the word of about 800 of the best witnesses in this country and abroad.
But you yourself have never seen a flying saucer?
I've just been a reporter, and a careful one.
Thank you very much, Major Donald Keyhoe.
Most people think the interest in UFOs is limited to a few cranks. In fact, there are thousands of intelligent people who get together at international conferences all over the world to study them. We visited one at Chicago to interview the man who for 20 years was head of the U.S. Air Force Top Security investigation into UFOs, Dr. Allen Hynek.
It's particularly heartening to me to see the rise of interest among scientists, and particularly astronomers, in the UFO problem. So it has often been said that, why don't astronomers see UFOs? As a matter of fact, they do. In a very recent report by Professor Sturrock of Stanford University, who queried all the members of the American Astronomical Society, found that 53% of those who responded said that, in their opinion, the UFO problem was worthy of scientific study. And what is more, 64 of the astronomers who responded gave what would be called UFO reports, objects, sightings that they personally had made at their observatories frequently, which to them was unexplained.
Dr. Hynek was officially researching UFOs for the U.S. Air Force and compiling a classified report known as Project Sign, later to become known as Project Blue Book.
Well, it was as an astronomer that I first became associated with the UFO problem. In 1948, the Air Force asked me, as an astronomer, to assist them in seeing how many of the reports on flying saucers that were coming in at that time could be explained astronomically. And one thing led to another, and I became scientific consultant to the Air Force and remained so for some 20 years. I started almost as a complete skeptic, because I thought the whole thing was a question of post-war nerves, but it was the persistence of the phenomenon, it refused to dry up and blow away, that finally led me to the belief that we had a real phenomenon to deal with. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the advent of the flying saucer, and that is a most unfortunate term, in my opinion, because it invites ridicule. It opens the door to a great deal of buffoonery and lampooning. It had a perfectly good history, because when Kenneth Arnold described the motions of the discs that he had seen, he said that it was like skipping a saucer over water. But some reporter thought that was a very clever term, and flying saucers were born. But it is really too bad, because it has caused a great deal of jokes and so forth. For instance, one common expression is that if you want to see a flying saucer, just goose the waitress. There is a shyness and a reluctance on the part of many witnesses, and understandably so, against reporting, because too many have been ridiculed and life has been made somewhat miserable for them. But at the Center for UFO Studies, both in the States and in Australia, it is our standard practice never to use a person's name without their specific permission. So if any of our viewers have what they feel is a valid UFO experience and have not reported it, by all means, I would say it is your scientific duty to report this, and with the assurance that your names will not be used without your permission.
So this is something I feel like, if I was the president, and it's unlikely that that is ever going to happen.
You never know.
If I was the president...
It was unlikely that I was going to be president.
The moment I was inaugurated, my hand would it'd still be hot from touching the Bible, and I would immediately race to wherever they have the files about Area 51 and the UFOs, and I go through everything to find out what happened.
Right.
Did you do that?
That's why you will not be president. Because that's the first thing that you would do.
It's at the
The
top
aliens
of my
won't
list.
let it happen. You reveal all their secrets. They exercise strict control over us.
Now, you know, there are a lot of people that are going to examine your facial expressions here, every twitch, everything, and say, and of course, so did you look? Did you see? Did you explore?
I can't reveal anything.
Oh, really? Because President Clinton said he did go right in, and he did check, and there was nothing.
Well, you know, that's what we're instructed to say.
All right.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers. The Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling of an obligation to identify and analyze to the best of our ability anything in the air that may have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States. In pursuit of this obligation, since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate with to any conceivable threat to the United States. We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any department of the United States. We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
Major Keyhole, as author of the book Flying Saucers Are Real, what is your opinion of these new sightings of unidentified objects?
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin. During a 3-year investigation, I found that many pilots have described objects of substance and high speed. One case, pilots reported their plane was buffeted by an object which passed them at 500 miles an hour. Obviously, this was a solid object, and I believe it was from outer space.
Gathered in a schoolyard with about 20 other men, and we saw a bright light appear in the distant western skies, and it got closer and closer, and when it was just above the treetops, it changed color, and then it stayed there for a while, and then it disappeared into the distance. And none of us could ever imagine what it was, and I still don't know what it was.
In 76, he said you'd try and release all information to the public and to scientists about other UFO sightings.
Yes.
Do you think you achieved that?
I'm not sure, but we did release a lot of the information, but I don't know how much was not released.
I couldn't help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children, wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species from another planet outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together. Well, I don't suppose we can wait for some alien race to come down and threaten us, but I think that between us we can bring about that realization. In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. But I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all?
Tonight we have an exciting guest coming up, Larry Holcombe. Larry is a prolific author and researcher and has done an incredible amount of work to legitimize the field of ufology. But before we get to that, I'd just like to share that I've had an experience, a medical experience, which has caused me to slightly lose my voice, as it were, and that's why I'm going with the sexy jazz voice right now. The interesting thing about this is that it could have been prevented. So to anybody out there who has any health problems and you're hesitating to take care of them, I urge you, please take care of them. It was the first time in my life I could say that I was foxhole praying that please don't let this be the way I go. What a dumb way to die, especially if you're dealing with infections. So to all of you, please be healthy and take care of yourself and the ones that you love, and think about them and the decisions that you make. Okay, that aside, I'm really excited. Our guest is Larry Holcombe. He's an early retiree as a military sales manager, as well as owner of his own construction-related sales and marketing business, which he had closed to begin writing in 2006. Which took off with his novel, The Great River Disclosure, thus leading up to his latest nonfiction work, The Presidents and UFOs, A Secret History from FDR to Obama. Larry's had his own UFO encounter in 1995, but was originally inspired by reading Major Donald Keyhoe's Flying Saucers Are Real. Larry, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here, Alan.
Well, besides Larry, Donald Kehoe's flying saucers are real, was there anything else in particular that really got you to sink your teeth into the subject matter?
Yeah, it sure was. When I read Kehoe's books, Flying Saucers for Real and Flying Saucers from Outer Space, that I found in my high school library in 1960, those two books, Kehoe's zest, his zeal for the subject, and his firm belief that the Air Force was involved in a cover-up of what they knew, was very fascinating to me, and I believe what he wrote. There were other books out at the time, George Adamski's books, which I looked at with a very disbelieving eye, if you will, although he's gained some popularity recently. But in any case, Kehoe was very believable. Then I saw Kehoe on the old Armstrong Circle Theater being interviewed by the Air Force. I read that he was going to be on, and being interviewed on the Armstrong Circle Theater with the Air Force there as counterpoint. Well, I believed that Kehoe was just going to break the flying saucer story wide open. And at that time, I was 17 years old, very naive, and sat on the edge of my chair watching this television program, which maybe don't know, but back in 1960s, television was hit or miss. You always had breakdowns and vacuum tubes blowing up and that type of thing in the cameras. And so I listened to Kehoe in really disgust. I thought that he was going to come on strong, arguing against the Air Force and arguing that the Air Force was covering up this information. And was really pretty disgusted that he sat meekly by without saying a great deal.
So why did he do that?
Well, finally, toward the end of the show, he said, I have some things to say that have never been said publicly before. At that point, his sound was cut off. I found out in the paper the next day. I thought it was technical problems. I was furious. How could they have a technical problem at this point? Found out the next day the Air Force had come in with a prepared script of what could be discussed and what couldn't be discussed. They put another officer in the control booth. Kehoe wanted to balk. He wanted to walk away. As a matter of fact, a couple of other people that were going to be on the show did walk away from it. They wouldn't go with the Air Force dictating what they could say and what they couldn't say. But Kehoe said that he thought that if he went on the show, that probably he could sneak a few minutes in past the Air Force. Well, that didn't happen. So I knew from that time on there was a cover-up. The Air Force was censoring the program. They couldn't do that today, I don't think, but back then the producers caved into them, and that's the way it was. So from that time on, after reading Kehoe's books and then seeing him censored, I was sure that Kehoe was telling the absolute truth, that he was really onto something. And
well, certainly his books would indicate so.
Yes. So it was about that time, Alan, that I had met earlier an older fellow who had just opened up leased a new Sunoco service station in the little village of Stanton, Virginia, just outside of Richmond, near Richmond International Airport. And that's where I lived, in Stanton. And I became friends with this fellow, Doug Locke. Doug was in his mid-30s. And he'd come from a tobacco farm down in Southside Virginia. So you wouldn't think that Doug was a very worldly sort of individual. But he had told me that he'd been in the Air Force. And long story, which I won't go into here, but at that time that he was in the Air Force, a AAU wrestling champion, Emilio Bruno, who knew Curtis LeMay, told Curtis LeMay that LeMay ought to seriously considering getting some pilots trained as judo instructors to instruct other pilots in judo, in martial arts, in case The planes went down in enemy territory, et cetera, et cetera. LeMay thought it was a good idea, so he got his subordinate, General Thomas Powell, to take on this program, and Powell sent out a message, edict, if you will, to Air Force bases around the country that he needed 24 volunteers to go to the Kodokan School in Japan for training, judo training by a world-renowned judo instructor, Japanese judo instructor.
That's pretty. It sounds almost kind of comic book like, that's to have people just train specifically to combat Japanese airmen who are coming down.
Right. Well, that's what I thought too, and I have checked that out thoroughly, and that checks. I have gone into. I have checked this out, and this did happen, and so that part's clear. Doug told me that he was one of those people, and he became a judo instructor at Biggs Air Force Base. Well, Doug being from the country and what have you, and I had this great interest in UFOs, and I liked being around Doug because he worked on cars and he liked fast cars, and he did a little racing himself, and that fascinated me, 17-year-old boy, back then. Mm-hmm. But I was reluctant to discuss my interest in flying saucers with Doug. But I finally, because I thought he'd say, "Oh, you silly kid, you don't believe in that kind of stuff."
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Anyway, I finally steeled myself to being ridiculed by Doug, and I told him, I said, "I've read a couple of books, and I've seen this man on television, and he talks about flying saucers and as being real, and he's convinced that they're extraterrestrial." And I just braced myself to be lambasted, and Doug looked at me, and I'll never forget it. He looked at me and he said, "Larry, it's all true." And I said, I was taken back, and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When I was instructing pilots at Biggs Air Force Base, they told me fascinating stories, scary stories of encounters they had with flying saucers when they were flying in the Four Corners area." Now, of course, Biggs Air Force Base is within a stone's throw of Roswell. And he went on to say that Roswell Air Force Base, for some reason, seemed to be the center of where all of these information was going. And he said, actually, I have heard pilots tell, I had one bomber pilot tell me that he flew recovered crashed alien spacecraft from Roswell to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, along with humanoid bodies. Well, that was a little too much for me to grasp. I was very interested in flying saucers, but when you start talking about alien bodies, that, I think, unnerved me a little bit.
Right, and how old were you again at this point?
I was 17 years old, and this is in 1960. Now, the importance here is not that I knew about it before any other UFO researcher knew about it. The importance is that in 1960, Doug Locke was telling me a story focusing on Roswell, even though that he was in Biggs Air Force Base. All of his information focused on Roswell, and that's where most of these pilots were coming from. So they weren't a judo instructor at each base. They had them in centralized bases, so that these pilots would come from surrounding bases to Biggs to be trained in judo in Doug's operation. And so the point is, in 1960, Doug was telling me a story that absolutely overlapped the story that came out in 1979 and 1980 through Stanton, Friedman, and Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt in their book. It's an exact copy of what they said 20 years before the story actually broke. Of course, it broke for a day or two and was in the Roswell paper in 1947, but then the explanation that it was nothing but a weather balloon, so the whole story died down. The press just walked away from it. In 1980, we found out that there was a real story to Roswell, and Roswell became famous. But I knew about it in 1960. So you see, I think that's an important piece of the Roswell puzzle.
Sure. Well, as you know, so many people have had their own eyewitness experiences, and also they've met people and talked to people who've had eyewitness experiences and shared information. But you've done a lot of work as far as documentation and using the FOIA Act. Did you have any documentation to help back up this story that Doug Locke told you?
I have recently, I wrote to what do they call themselves at the paperwork here, to the request for military records from I forget what operation it was called, Air Force Personnel Center. No, that's not it. Anyway,
you're not talking about something like Project Blue Book, or?
Well, it's National Personnel Records Center, and they sent me back a form to fill out. They had already filled in Doug's name because I sent them his name, but they sent me back a form to fill out to put his birthday in, the date he enlisted in the Air Force, the day he was discharged from the Air Force, his Air Force numbers, serial numbers, and which I didn't have. So a lot of the stuff I had, a lot of the stuff I didn't have. I know that he was born in 1928, but I don't know the date. I knew he was born, or his parents came from Halifax County, Virginia, which is near a small town called South Boston. And I wrote to the records people there, and they very nicely sent me Doug's mother and father's wedding certificate that they found, and they sent me Doug's last will and testament. Doug died in 1978 from asbestos poisoning. When before and after his service station work, he worked as an electrician in New York City, in Newport News, at the Newport News shipbuilding, a number of power plants around the East Coast. And he was exposed, and this was in the 1950s and 1960s, and he was exposed to a great deal of asbestos. He never smoked, but he was exposed to asbestos, and he developed, I forget the melanoma, or the lung cancer.
It's such a shame, and it's still going on today. It's absolutely deplorable. Yeah.
Well, he sued, before he died, he sued Johns Manville Corporation, and I have the full documents of that lawsuit. So that gave me some information on his exact time of death, his age at death. But I have the year of his birth, but I don't have the exact place of birth. I think it was either South Boston or Charlotte County, Virginia. So I put that on the form to send back to the National Records Center. I put all the information I could put on there, that he was a judo instructor in Biggs Air Force Base, and the dates I found from Doug's interrogatory on his will when he was inducted into the Air Force, which was December of 1950, and when he left the Air Force in March or April of 1954, I think it was. So I have that information. I'm now waiting to get back his records, and all I want to do is get verification from the Air Force that he was a judo instructor at Biggs Air Force Base. That's the main thing. Now, of course, I could be lying, that possibility with debunkers always exists. You could say that I'm just making the story up.
Larry, when you talk to somebody, how do you gauge whether you think they're telling the truth or not?
I've dealt with a lot of people in my business career, and you get a feeling for when people are lying and when people are not. There's no question in my mind Doug wasn't lying. I mean, I knew him well, and I never, ever saw him tell a lie. I remember he told me a story about Eddie Biggs, that he had a friend, he said an old, tall, lanky Midwesterner that had this motorcycle, this fantastic motorcycle that I'd never heard of. Now, again, this is back in the early 50s. And he said he took me for a ride on this motorcycle, and the name of the motorcycle was a Vincent Black Shadow. I'd never heard of it. And he said he took me out on those desert roads in New Mexico, and he said, this crazy guy, I'm riding on the back of it, and he's telling me about his eyelids turning backwards. And he said, while this guy is running 130 miles an hour, holding on to the handlebars with one hand and bent over and adjusted on the carburetors with his other hand. So I remember him telling me that story. I looked up a Vincent Black Shadow recently when Doug's story started to come back to me. I'd forgotten a lot of it. And come to find out, Jay Leno owns several of them. They're prized motorcycles in his car and motorcycle collection. So that verified the story. As far as
Jay Leno probably owns about 5% of the cars and motorcycles on the planet.
Yeah, he does. And I watch on his program a lot, but he's yeah. But in any case, that's just an example that he had no reason to tell me the story. But the reason that you would have to think that it's true, and this is strictly my word, see, that Doug told me this, because I'm alive today, and I heard the story from the 80s and 90s about Roswell and there. But if Doug told me the story in 1960, if I'm telling the truth and Doug told the story in 1960, then it's a strong confirmation that the Roswell event happened, and it was an extraterrestrial event, if you follow my logic. Because he didn't know anything about it then. Now, he didn't know, as best I can recall, and keep in mind, we're talking about a lot of years ago. I'm 73 years old, and I was 17 then. So my memory is sort of vague, but I do remember that he didn't know why Roswell was the center for all of this information and all of these crashed craft going there. Well, we know now that Roswell was the home of the 509th Bomb Group, and the security at that base, they were the only atomic bomb group in existence, and the security of that base was severe. And it would be the logical base. If they were recovering extraterrestrial craft, that would be the logical base to stage it out of, even though the material went elsewhere, Wright-Patterson probably.
Sure, it also sounds like the logical base to do testing.
Yeah, well, and that's why in my research there are, oh goodness, so many people that worked in New Mexico, Dr. Charles Moore, Dr. Lincoln LaCause, Edward Teller, Clyde Tombaugh, just to name a few. And all of these people had seen these craft. One scientist wrote somewhere, and I've been trying to find it, and can't, that these craft were so prevalent every time they had a test, whether it was a V-2 rocket test or an atomic test, that they knew these craft were going to show up. And they did. They were always there. Well, it just stands to reason that if we do have extraterrestrial visitors, as I feel confident we do, they would want to be there viewing these tests. And Alan, let me say here, my research is in flying saucers, as I like to call them. I'm not too fond of the term UFO. It's all encompassing. I like flying saucers because it indicates a craft that operates when viewed by people from a proper distance and people of character and quality, what have you, like policemen, military officers, what have you. And it performs in a manner that is well beyond our known laws of physics. Or
sure, though flying would indicate, within the laws of physics, though.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm certainly we've come a long way, but we didn't have that kind of craft in 1947.
Sure,
things that they could do. So, and so many people said that they saw these craft, and you would have to think that they would be interested in what we were doing here. Furthermore, I think that people say, well, how can you believe that a craft would fly across the vastness of space with all of the what it would have to put up with meteorites and or whatever they could encounter in space, and then get to Earth and crash the thing? Well, my answer is that I think the craft that crash here are not craft that flew across the vastness of space. They are simply probes that are being sent from the craft that did fly across the vastness of space. And probably the beings that were found in these craft, either dead or alive, were androids, were engineered beings that were possibly part of the operating system of the craft. So
you're still defending the idea of long-term travel, long-distance travel, and because they're not biological beings, it could have taken thousands of years to get here?
No, really, my belief is that we're probably dealing with a civilization or civilizations that are so far advanced, 100,000 years, a million years, that what we call the laws of known physics today is so far antiquated. It's like believing the ancients believing that they sailed too far from shore, the ships would sail off the edge of the earth. It's that antiquated, and they long ago have learned how to conquer time and space, and they can get from there to here in a very quick amount of time. I mean, and I'm getting into an area that I've read about. I've listened to length to Dr. Mikhail Keku.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the Alcubierre, the Alcubierre drive, the theory devised by the Mexican physicist, I think in 1994, that kind of opens the door for interstellar warp travel. And even though it's a theory, it's the idea that there is some possibility there, I think proves that with progress and with time, we may actually be able to crack that door open.
I think so. Some people think we already have. I find that dubious, but there's no doubt that we've got aerial platforms flying out in Utah and Nevada that are many years ahead of what we know now.
Well, in your travels, have you found any hotspots yourself where you can catch UFOs?
No, not really. Certainly there are a lot of people that claim that there are hotspots around, and I think they are. And I think that nuclear facilities are one. I think that they're constantly seeing both nuclear weapons facilities and nuclear peacetime facilities, such as the nuclear power plants, or see these objects a lot. power generating stations, big power generating stations have encountered them. You know, the Great Northeast Blackout, there was some pretty well documented reports that UFOs or flying saucers were seen around a major power generating station in somewhere in Canada, and that it escapes me exactly where it was, but that makes no difference. It was investigated in depth by the brilliant atmospheric physicist and a true hero of mine. Hero of mine. And my mind goes blank. Dr. Jim McDonald, Dr. James A. McDonald, who was a great, brilliant atmospheric physicist from University of Arizona, and he got heavily involved in the UFO issue, and it ended up costing him his life. But and I think it's a shame because he died far too young, and he was.
How do you mean it cost his life?
He became very, very involved in the study of UFOs, and he traveled extensively. He had a very close relationship with his wife, Betsy, that he called Bets. And but he was away from home probably the majority of the time for 6 years, and he was also involved in the congressional hearings over the supersonic transport, and he went before the congressional hearings on supersonic transport, and a senator or congressman made fun of him because of his background in UFO or flying saucer research. Ridicule, and that hurt McDonald greatly. When he returned home, his beloved wife, Bets, informed him that his long absence from home, tongue gets tied up, that they had worked on her greatly, and she had become involved with a younger man. And these two things together just crushed McDonald. And in, I think it was 1971, he took a pistol and tried to take his own life, and failed. But he was blinded, and he couldn't take it, and he tried it again the second time and succeeded. So it's a sad story.
So the spirit of truth seeking was crushed, and it just crushed his soul.
Yeah, it really was. And then, of course, Alan Hynek died of cancer sometime after that, and Jim McDonald and Alan Hynek, they've really had some knockdown, drag-out fights. They both felt the same way, but McDonald felt that Hynek should be more forceful in his beliefs that we're dealing with an extraterrestrial presence. And I remember Jacques Vallée writing that he remembers standing in Hynek's office. He worked with Hynek. He was an associate of Hynek. Sure. When Jim McDonald was there beating on Hynek's desk and saying, Alan, why didn't you come out with this? Why didn't you tell this? Why didn't you go public with this information? And Jacques Vallée said he knew very well why Hynek didn't do it, because he thought it would ruin his reputation at Northwestern, where he was head of the astronomy department in Northwestern, and he was afraid of it, of ruining his reputation, where McDonald's attitude was full speed ahead. I don't give a damn. This is something to it, and I'm going to find out what it is. And according
Well, it does
to...
beg the question, what drives a person to that point? I mean, especially someone with the training and background that he has.
Yeah. And, for people to say there's nothing but kooks involved in this, these are two examples right there that these people weren't kooks by any imagination. Now, they were trying to use in what I do in my work is, although I'm not a scientist, I try to use straight line scientific research. I don't buy into a lot of these fringe stories, and I hear a lot of them, and you do too. I stay pretty focused on what can be proven and story or stories by very reputable people that are solid individuals and have no reason to lie, and are telling stories that are truly astounding. And these are the stories that I put in my book. I did miss one that when the book was published in March of 2015 in hardcover by St. Martin's Press, I might mention, which I was very pleased to get St. Martin's interested in the book and to buy the book. And then St. Martin's released it in paperback this past August. And I have a 4-chapter afterword that I put in. And one of the stories that I wanted to put in was the famous RB-47 case that took place back in the 50s over the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, Gulf of Mexico, and then inland over Mississippi, Louisiana, and then on into Texas.
Well, Larry, if I could flip it on you, actually, because I asked you earlier about Doug Locke, right, and what makes you think that you can believe someone, but have you come across anyone who at first you didn't believe, you thought perhaps was a kook, and then later proved otherwise?
I guess that would be a qualified yes. I'm still not convinced in some of the famous stories. I'm still not convinced in Bob Lazar's story. It's simply because Stan Friedman pretty well proved that his academic background that he claimed he had, he didn't have. It was not true.
And do you rule out that it could have been expunged?
That's what he claims. But everybody that Friedman has checked with at MIT and Caltech said that's impossible. That can't happen. Well, with that said, we know the government can do a lot of impossible things. So I don't know. But Bob's story is interesting, but it certainly continues to reside in my dubious file.
Well, a lot of people don't trust that the government can even keep a secret, but actually you contend that the military is the one that can actually keep a secret, right? Not the intelligence community.
That's exactly right. You go right to the heart of it. You are exactly right. When people say the government can't keep secrets, they're primarily thinking. They may not be thinking directly about it, but what they are talking about, in essence, is political secrets. And I agree, you can't keep political secrets because you've got two political parties that are trying to outdo each other. And it's almost impossible to keep political secrets of any kind. However, the Manhattan Project went on for 10 or 12 years in total secrecy. And no one in Congress knew about it. Harry Truman didn't know about it until after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, that the Manhattan Project even existed. And here at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a city had been built. One building was a mile long. They had dammed up the Tennessee River, and they were producing for Oak Ridge Laboratories 10% of the electricity that was used in the entire United States. That's incredible. And it did it in complete secrecy. Same thing out at Las Cruces and Sandia Labs in New Mexico. The atomic bomb was being worked on in total secrecy, and no one knew about it. Stealth fighter, stealth bomber, they were around flying for 20 years before anybody knew they existed.
Well, that begs the question too. How do they test flight any kind of experimental craft now without being seen by, just a satellite image by chance or by accident or any other device out there?
I think they probably typically they fly them at night. We know, and I think people do see them. Mm-hmm. And I think that UFOs have been used by the government to their advantage to cover up some of these craft as being UFOs. Our government in the intelligence community is very clever and can do a lot of things. Now, that's not to say that I believe that all experimental aircraft are UFOs or what flying saucers, if you will. Mm-hmm. But I think that some are, and I think that the government has used them for that. But let's take Dugway Proving Ground, where I think a lot of this stuff goes on. Dugway has just built a runway that is, I can't remember the length of it, but it's a fantastic length. It's something like, I don't know, 14, 15 miles long, something of that fact. What are they landing there or taking off from there? Are we putting vehicles into space, launching vehicles from the land and putting them into space? Of course, there's a lot of people that believe that there's a secret space program. Again, that's in my dubious basket. I need more proof than I've got to buy into that. But I don't rule, Alan, I don't rule things out. I know that we're involved in more stuff than can be imagined, so I don't rule out anything that somebody says or claims, but I don't buy it either offhand. I've got to have some pretty solid background. Sure, and since you've started your research and your writing, I'm sure plenty of people have sent you emails, phone calls, come up to you in person, and tried to share some story of their own. Has there been a particular story that you find very entertaining, maybe not necessarily true, but just a good story? Oh, I've gotten a number of stories that I think are true. In my book, I relate a story that a young lady told me that has a pretty high position in the entertainment industry in Hollywood. And she was initially talked through my agent with her about my book. The reason she was interested in it was that she had a UFO sighting while on a Friday night with a friend while driving to inland California, to a lake area in inland California. Primarily this was a lake that just provided irrigation water for the crops. So this was in the crop growing section. And they like to go out there and camp. It was not an official campground, but they just like to go out there, and apparently the farmers or whoever owned it didn't mind people coming out and camping. Maybe charge them a fee, I don't know. But anyway, as they were going out there, and this was out in the agricultural section of California, she said it was after dark, and she saw a light out in the field off to the several hundred yards away from their car. And she looked at it and she said she thought it was a crop duster at first. But then she noticed that it was matching the speed of their car. And as it would come to a hedgerow of trees, it would rise up straight go over the trees and then drop back down. If they speeded up, whatever this object was, speeded up. And she said finally she could get a look at it, and it did appear to be some sort of roundish craft.
Was it glowing, or?
She said there were some lights around the perimeter, but they were not intense.
Mm-hmm.
And she said there's no sound. And this went on. They'd speed up, and then they stopped, and the object stopped. And they started off again. Now, they're getting pretty panicky by now. And she said all of a sudden, the object shot forward and shot right out in the roadway in front of them, about 200 or 300 yards. And she said they really freaked out then. And then all of a sudden it took off straight up and just vanished. They went on to the campsite. They related this incident to their friends. And I said, did you see anything else? She said the next night, the same object appeared over the lake. We all saw it, but it did not approach us. It hovered over the lake. She said the one thing that was noticeable was there were animals around in the distance, dogs and farm animals, and they went crazy. And she said, but then the object took off, and that was the last they'd seen of it. Now, she didn't want me to reveal the name that's in the book is not a real name. She didn't want this reveal, and she said she thought because it could cause her great harm with the position that she held with this pretty well-known talent or agency. And of course, I honored her request. But she did want to tell the story. And I think it was, and I had a hard time getting back in touch with her. She was so busy. Her secretary continued to call me and put off the call and put off the call and put off the call. So I think we were supposed to talk 1 month, and I think it was actually the next month before we got together, and she had the time to get together and talk with me. She was very, very busy. But I believe her. I believe that story.
Well, it's a fascinating story. And the thing is, so often you hear that people have these encounters more than one night in a row, these sightings.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's anything that is to that? Why will there be an event in a sense, not just a one night thing, but you'll have people see something for 2 or 3 nights and then it stops?
I asked her if she experienced any loss of time, which she said no, there was no loss of time. We got to the campsite when we thought we were going to get there. Mm-hmm. And so it was, and she had never had any previous experience, no abduction experience or anything like that. So it seemed to be a one-time deal. I've got a host of letters, really, and I need to organize them. I've got them on my computer, but I need to organize them, get them in a file, from people that have written me about incidents that they've had. Some I believe, some I question, and some I think are just downright kooky. In other words, I don't believe it. And I've gotten photographs. I got a terrific photograph of a disc-shaped UFO hovering over a man's backyard in South Carolina. It's a beautiful photograph in quite a lot of detail, to the point that it was so much detail that I have to believe that it was probably photoshopped.
Sure. Well, Larry, let's hold it right there. We're going to take a quick break. This is your host, Alan B. Smith, with Paranormal Now, live on the Inception Radio Network. And stay tuned as we talk more about the Nixon administration and the NBC documentary that would have shocked the world.
Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Remember, you can take your Inception Radio shows on the go. Just download the Inception Radio Network app for your iPhone, iPad, or Android smartphones and access live shows, past shows, guest lineups, and much more. Just visit the iTunes Store or the Google Play Marketplace and download it today for free. You didn't forget what's coming up tonight, did you? Hi, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Never miss that interview you were looking forward to or the show on your favorite topic. Follow IRN on Twitter, I_R_N, and get reminders about the evening's live shows as well as fun and important updates throughout the week. That's I_R_N, and never miss a great show again.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. My guest is Larry Holcombe, author of The Presidents and UFOs, A Secret History from FDR to Obama. So, Larry, let's cut back to the Doug Locke story and move forward from there.
I followed what I guess people now call ufology from then on. The strange thing, and I really can't explain it, is that for some reason, when the Roswell story broke in 1979, 1980, I looked at it with great interest, and I said, why don't these people know about Roswell? Why is Roswell so important to me? Why are people just finding out about Roswell when Roswell is, this is my thought process now, that Roswell has always been as important to me as in ufology as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I did not remember the Doug Locke story as we've talked about. For some reason, I put up a mental block. And Alan, I can't explain that. I can't. But when I started writing The Presidents and UFOs, the fog started to lift. And all of a sudden it came back like hitting me upside the head. And I went to my wife and I said, Alice, and I said, Alice, do you remember when we were dating? And remember, I met Doug when I was 17 years old.
I hope she did.
I was, I was probably when we started. I met Alice when she was 21, and I still do Doug Locke. Anyway, I said, when we were dating, do you remember me telling you a story? And she knew my interest in flying saucers and what have you, UFOs. And I said, do you remember me telling you a story that Doug Locke told me about when he was in Texas in El Paso at Biggs Air Force Base, and pilots telling him stories about flying saucers and even crash saucers? And she said, yeah, I remember you telling me the story. She remembered it. I put it out of my mind. And the only reason I can figure that I did was because at 17 years old, I wasn't ready to accept alien bodies. You know, I was interested in these flying machines that were flying around in our airspace at will, and we couldn't do anything about it. But and I don't know that's the case. That's the only reason that I can tell you that I forgot about Doug and Doug being behind the Roswell story. Then it came to me, and the fog started to lift, and I remembered more and more and more about it. I remember his father, who was a Baptist minister, coming by visiting our house in Stanton and saying that he had been encouraging Doug to get a group of youngsters, church youngsters, together at the Baptist church there in Stanton and teach them judo, you know, like get them off the street, teach them something that they can go back out on the street and beat people up. But anyway, I remember him saying that. So I kind of kept this in the dark. I studied it. I'd go to the library and go right to books on paranormal and New Age and look for everything I could find on UFOs. I got Timothy Good's great book above Top Secret, although Tim has seemed to have gotten off into the fringe area here recently, but neither here nor there. So after I retired and decided to start writing, the acceptance of people believing in that we perhaps are being visited, the stigma has sort of gone away, and people are no longer looked at as nuts that believe in this thing, this phenomenon. So I became open with it, and I've been amazed at the amount of people who have come forward and share my opinion and want to talk about it. I mean, people of respect and people that have had their own experiences, and so that's pretty much how I moved forward with it, and then got in when I took early retirement and got into book writing and started doing serious research, going to presidential libraries, doing research in presidential libraries, and which are where you're not going to find a smoking gun, but you will, in many cases, find good timeline information that ties in with a particular president doing something at a particular time that ties in with a major UFO event.
So circumstantial evidence.
Right. Okay. And a lot of people have been put in jail on circumstantial evidence. So
good point. Yeah. Or less. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a lot of good stories that I've come across. One story that I love to tell, if you don't mind.
No, go right ahead.
In researching the book, I was fascinated by the fact that the Air Force was under a great deal of pressure in the mid-1960s. And so that they formed a committee, and I can't remember the name of the committee. I think it was the O'Brien Committee. Anyway, they recommended to the Air Force to go out, and this is because the Air Force was being pushed by Hynek, and in particular, Dr. McDonald, Jim McDonald, who could be a real thorn in their side, to have congressional hearings. So the Air Force said, well, look, let's go out and hire a university to research this project. We'll give them $500,000. Well, they decided to do that. The problem was they went around to a lot of well-known universities. I think they went to Harvard. They went to Heinrich Northwestern. I think they went to Duke. They don't want it. They don't want to touch it. Even for $500,000, they did not want to touch it. So they went to the University of Colorado, which was cash-strapped at the time, and they saw this $500,000 dangling in their face. So they decided to take the project on. And it was called the Colorado Project. Heading a project.
So it was more of a charity project.
I think there could be some debate about that, but anyway, when you think about the fact that they put Dr. Edward U. Condon, who was in charge of either their astronomy or physics department, I can't remember which. Condon was a very brilliant man, no question about it, but they put him in charge of the program. The problem was Condon didn't like it. He didn't like the idea of it. He thought it was pure trash. The whole thing was pure trash.
He was biased from the start.
Yeah, he was very biased from the start. So he set up a group of scientists. 2 years were spent on the project. At the end of the 2 years, the report, the Condon Report, so-called Condon Report, came out of the Colorado Project. Condon's report comprised 2 sections of the report. His scientist work comprised the other 2 sections of the report. Well, Condon, in essence, said UFOs are baloney. It's nothing to them. They're nothing but prosaic objects. The Air Force should get out of the business of even fooling with them, even studying them in any way. That was his part of the report. The other part of the report was completely different from that. The scientists that worked for Condon said, this is something serious. We see about 30% that can't be explained. And it's a serious scientific issue that needs more research. So here, Condon's report from his own people was was a whitewash of what they had found. So, but of course the press took Condon's report and ran with it. The Air Force did backflips and shut down Project Blue Book. Then we know that General Carol Bolender came out with a memo that said, the famous Bolender memo that said, now that Project Blue Book has shut down all UFO reports that may affect, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Larry.
That may affect national security will be reported as they always have been, meaning Blue Book didn't get the good stuff. Never did get the good stuff. It was reported through Air Force Joint Army Navy Publication 146, JNAP, which is Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146, something else, I forget what it was, and that was the way they would continue to be reported. Okay, so we had that memo, which in essence said, if you read it right, that Blue Book was nothing but a propaganda machine to begin with. Now, here's the part I love. This is the part that breaks me up. University of Colorado in Condon is collecting $500,000 from the Air Force. Right up the road in Colorado Springs, Colorado's Air Force Academy. They're teaching their cadets a course in physics called, Introductory Space Science, Volume 2, Department of Physics, United States Air Force, et cetera, Chapter 33, Unidentified Flying Objects. So they go some pages where they're teaching their students about flying saucers, flying objects. At the end, in the conclusion, they say, we could very well be being visited by as many as 4 extraterrestrial races. But so keep an open mind and don't draw solid conclusions on either side of the issue. Now here in Colorado Springs, in their physics class, Air Force cadets are being told that there may be as many as 4 extraterrestrial races visiting Earth, while Condon and the University of Colorado collecting $500,000 from the Air Force, tell them that there's nothing to it. They ought to get out of the business entirely. I think
that's virtually a smoking gun right there.
I think it's hilarious. I really do. Yeah. And it was proven. It was first reported in the National Enquirer, which we got what people would say was not, the paragon of great information, but a newspaper in Northern California, and I forget what city. It wasn't Los Angeles. It wasn't San Francisco. So anyway, they called the Public Information Office at the Air Force Academy, and they asked them about this. And the major somebody said, yes, that is in our textbook. And that is what we are teaching our students in that physics class. So the paper wrote an article that that's what was being taught there. Within a matter of a short period of time, all those textbooks were removed from the course, and that chapter was taken out of it, and they were replaced. So I think that's a very interesting story, one that I find humorous and sad at the same time.
Are there any other surviving copies of this book?
I don't know of any. And Alan Hynek had a copy. Jacques Vallée writes that Alan Hynek had a copy, not of the book, but of the chapter 30, of the entire chapter 33 out of the book, and showed it to him. And Vallée said, why didn't you go public with this? And he said, well, hemmed and hawed around with something. Again, Hynek was really concerned about his reputation, and he was quite interested in the subject, and as you know, started the Center for UFO Studies. But he was quite concerned about his reputation, especially after he had been so badly burned with the swamp gases issue that he came out with, investigating the 1960s UFO sightings in Michigan.
Yeah, I guess that was a chip on his shoulder for a while.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it hurt him. It really made him look ridiculous to say that with his peers and with people in ufology.
But if I understand, it was slightly taken out of context, too, right?
Yeah. Alan Hynek said he didn't say that's what they all were. He said it is possible that some of the sightings could be swamp gas. So the paper said papers just went with Hynek says it's swamp gas, and that's not what he said at all.
And it's easy to make humor out of anything with the word gas, so I could see how they just jumped on that one. Yep.
So it's you gotta be really careful with some of these famous events. Going back to Eisenhower, there's a famous story about Eisenhower visiting a meeting with UFOs when he was vacationing in Palm Springs in December of 1954. I don't buy that story. Go ahead, you sound like you're going to say something.
It does have the sound of folklore.
Yes.
When you hear the story told.
Alan, the reason is that I don't know why his press secretary, Jim Haggerty, came out and said the president broke a tooth last night, chipped a tooth eating fried chicken, and we had to have emergency dental work, and so that's why you haven't seen him. Well, that was at 8 o'clock at night. The next morning, he went to church with Mamie. So I don't find it at all unusual. People have made it sound like it was unusual that Eisenhower was missing. I don't know why he was missing from 8 o'clock at night to 9 or 10 o'clock the next morning.
That's a bit of a reach.
Don't presidents have some privacy? Do they all have television cameras in their bedrooms so they can be watched all the time? So I don't buy that. They never could find a dentist that didn't even work on it. Now, the story I do buy into and has been researched in great detail by an acquaintance of mine, Art Campbell, is in 1955. A similar story occurred, and this was over a 3 or 4 day period. He was supposed to have gone bird hunting to, I think it was the Secretary of Treasury, if I believe correctly, owned a big plantation down in South Georgia. And Ike and Mamie and Mamie's mother flew down there for a few days, and Ike going bird hunting. Well, they got there in the afternoon, spent a couple of hours out bird hunting that afternoon, and it was cold and damp and frosty. And they came back in. Well, the next day, Haggerty went before the press and said, the president's come down with the sniffles, and nothing serious, but he's going to stay in for a couple of days, just sitting by the fire, playing Scrabble with baby and her mother or something, drinking hot toddies, and who knows. And so the story goes that he actually snuck away from the base, got on Columbine 3 or whatever that plane was at the time, that Super Constellation, flew to Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. And it is reported that he did meet with extraterrestrials, that these flying saucers came in, and as the story goes, the president's plane landed on the main runway and turned around and shut its engines off. It didn't taxi over the tarmac. It sat out on the runway. at the end of the runway, which in essence closed the runway down. And 2 alien craft came over. One hovered over the plane. The other one sat down in front of it. And as legend has it, that Eisenhower got out of his plane, walked over to the saucer, went aboard it, stayed aboard it for 45 minutes, then came back and got on the plane, and the saucers took off, and the plane went on and taxied into the air, into the base, and Eisenhower spoke to some of the people there in just very general terms, and then flew away. Now, there are eyewitnesses. There are 3 eyewitnesses that I know of, and I've got the recording of one eyewitness. It's called the Fireman story, because this was a lineman that went up on a telephone pole and saw this craft in the air, hovering in the air, coming toward him. He was stringing wire on the flight line, power line wire. And when he saw this craft sort of wobbling and coming toward him, he cut out of that pole and came down that pole and took off running. Said he stopped, and I've got a CD of his daughter reading this letter that he sent to the children, telling them this fireman story. And he stopped and turned around and looked, and the thing had stopped and was just hovering and sort of wobbling. Well, he ran on into the electrical shop, and all of the people in the electrical shop kidded him and said, "Man, you came down that pole faster than a fireman coming down the fire pole." So it became the fireman story. He believed that it was something that belonged to us, and he said in his letter that I've often wondered, if we had that technology, why we never used it in the wars. So he claims to have seen the craft. He saw Eisenhower's craft parked at the end of the runway. He doesn't say that he saw a saucer parked sitting on the ground in front of it, but he did see this saucer that he said looked like a 30 to 35 foot pie pan, or 2 pie pans put together. There are 2 more witnesses that Art Campbell dug up, reliable witnesses that saw this same thing that this lineman saw. Now, I don't believe for a minute that the President of the United States came off of his aircraft and by himself walked over across the runway and got into an alien spacecraft by himself, no Secret Service. The craft could have snapped the door shut and flown him off to goodness knows where. I don't believe that happened.
Well, if it happened to you and the aliens said, "Look, this is the prerequisite, just you or not," what would you do?
Well, you make a good point. That could be the case. That could be the case. I still find it very odd that the Secret Service would let him do it. Of course, he could overrule the Secret Service. Maybe he had met these aliens before and had developed some sort of relationship. I don't know. It's an interesting story. It's one that has some backup by respectable people. So I think that something happened at Holland. I think for sure that Eisenhower flew to Holland and was out there for a day, which would have been about, a 3.5, 4 hour flight from Georgia. And I think there's enough people that saw him land, 3 that I know of, that I think that he was there. And I think it's a very interesting story, and it could very well be true or partially true. But
Larry, we have a lot of ground to cover. So before we move forward into the Nixon era, Bob Evinger's NBC TV documentary, I just want to go back because as part of what you're talking about right now, it seems like so much happened within this period of time. So you have crash saucers and visitations. And then you have another story that you covered, Charlotte Man, which was 1941. So I guess I'm inquiring two things. One, what is the story of Charlotte Man? And two, why do these crashes and these meetings happen decades ago, and are they not happening now?
To answer the last question first, I think that the reason, and I call that the golden years of flying saucers and ufology, because we had paper trails to follow. Today we don't have those paper trails. It's all electronic. There is some paperwork generated, but not like it was back then. And this last campaign in Hillary Clinton's emails and all of that is an indication of that. But so it's much harder today to get evidence, and these documents are still highly classified. You can't get them. I mean, I've been turned down numbers of times for documents back from the late 40s and early 50s that they've been redacted from presidential libraries and just turned down, that they were non-responsive to my request. Because they're still classified above top secret or top secret. As far as Charlotte Man, she was the granddaughter of, I think it was either a Baptist or Methodist preacher in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. The Reverend Puffman was called to what was thought to be a plane crash in the early evening hours of one night. When he got to the scene, it was not a plane crash, but it was a disc-shaped object with several small humanoids laying outside, all apparently dead. The Reverend said last rites or prayed over him. And there were several reporters there with cameras. New reporters and cameramen were there, as were some firemen. Pretty soon the military showed up and got these people, or confiscated the cameras and got these people together and said, what you've seen here is highly classified and it's part of government security. You will not speak about it ever again to anyone. That's your patriotic duty, never to discuss it again. Well, apparently the Reverend did come home and tell his wife, but they never spoke of it again, except Charlotte said that you would hear little whispers of things from time to time. Her grandfather passed away. Her mother lived on, and when her mother was dying of cancer, Charlotte got her mother, her grandmother, to tell her the story, and that's where it came from Charlotte Man to Leonard Stringfield, the investigator and reporter Leonard Stringfield. She contacted him and told him her grandmother's story. So that's where that came from. Again, it's Charlotte Man's story. Can you back it up? It's just one of those things that you say sounds very interesting, but there's no really hard proof. But it does.
Well, let's just assume that it was true, and assume that Roswell was a crash as well. It just begs the question: why did these craft go down then? Why don't craft go down now?
Well, I don't know that they don't, Alan. I don't know that some of these things still go down.
But don't you think that there would be enough eyewitnesses or cameras or?
Well, it could very well be that in the 1940s, these craft we were experimenting with new equipment. In the case of Roswell, there was some very powerful radars that had just been developed that were really experimental, but they were placed in 3 locations in New Mexico, primarily to prevent air attacks on Sandia and Los Alamos and White Sands Proving Ground. And these were extremely high-powered radars. One report was that when those radars were turned on and geese would fly through them, it would kill the geese. It would partially cook them. And the people that were operating the radars would go get the geese, and they had a little restaurant in town that they liked to eat, and they'd take the geese to the owner of the restaurant and get him to finish cooking them.
So it was the original microwave.
Yeah. So there is speculation that these craft were encountering these new high-powered radars that was fouling up their guidance system. And these people didn't know, or this was new to these visitors and their equipment. And since then, they've made adjustments for that. So it doesn't, the radars or whatever does not affect them anymore. That's one theory. Of course, they said it could have been a thunderstorm, but it's hard for me to believe that any visitors from elsewhere wouldn't be aware of what a thunderstorm could do. And on top of that, it seems to be that they seem to be very interested in their electricity to the point that sometimes it looked like there were reports of these craft actually trying to recharging themselves on power lines. And that's what conceivably made the Great Northeast Blackout occur. But so it's all speculation, but I think it's reasonable speculation that these things are simply probes, that they're not down here with their so-called motherships. The motherships have certainly been seen. The Alaska incident, Japan Airlines Alaska incident from 1980, I think it was. That was certainly a mothership that the Captain Tarahucci and his flight crew encountered. So
what did they describe that they saw?
The Alaska Airlines incident.
Mm-hmm.
They were coming in. They were going to make a refueling stop and perhaps an overnight stay in Anchorage. And just after they'd crossed over into Anchorage, they were flying about 32,000 feet. And Captain Tarahucci saw a very bright light off to his left, and the cockpit was picking it up. It was about 5 miles off to its left wing. Now, there's certain variations on this story, but I think that this is generally accurate. They watched it for a while. They called Anchorage Center and asked them if they saw it. And at first they didn't see it, but then they were getting intermittent returns. They contacted Elmendorf Air Force Base. Elmendorf Air Force Base saw it and was picking it up. While they were watching it, within a period of 2 or 3 seconds, the craft moved from off of the left wing, the port wing, all the way over to 5.5 miles on the right wing. Well, as John Callahan,
that's a big craft. Jeez.
With John Callahan, who investigated for the FAA, he said that movement, and he had the telemetry data and all of the radar data sent to Washington for review, and he went public with it after he retired. And he said that means that craft moved, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of miles an hour to go in a matter of 2 or 3 seconds, that distance. The craft, you saw the picture in the book, I guess. You read the book, mm-hmm. You saw the picture in the book, that you have this 747 looks tiny compared to this huge thing that looks like an English walnut. Right. That went out in front of flew out in front of the airliner and put out 2 smaller orbs that flew back in front of the airliner, so close that Tarahucci said that he could feel heat from the craft on the flight deck.
Oh.
They went back to the mothership, if you will. And then it moved off. Well, Elmendorf Air Force Base controllers called the aircraft and said, "You've got the object now in trail," meaning it was behind it. Tarahucci at one point requested Anchorage to give him, allow him to make a 360-degree turn. They were shaken up. They wanted to get away from this thing. So they said, "Yes, go ahead and make your turn." Well, when he made the turn, the craft turned with him. That means they were on the outside of him. They had to speed up with him as he made a turn because they were 5 miles out beyond him. They had to speed up to match his speed in that turn.
Their heartbeats must have been pounding at that point.
Yeah. So the thing finally disappeared, and they landed successfully in Elmendorf. Yeah. And of course, there were people from the FAA and probably the CIA. I can't remember the story exactly. They had to greet him and debrief him on what he was. But here was a story that you had contact by radar, contact by individuals in the aircraft, and recorded with all the telemetry. Callahan had the stuff sent to D.C. He had the radar and the voice communications coordinated by computer. He played it. He was asked to come to the office of I forget who was head of FAA at the time. It was an admiral, I believe. And he asked to come to bring the data to D.C. Or to Atlantic City, and they were going to have a meeting in the offices of FAA in Atlantic City.
Atlantic City.
Yeah. And so he came there. I'm trying to think of his name, but that's not really important. He showed up with all of this data, and also present were 2 members of the Reagan White House and 3 CIA agents, and they looked at this stuff, looked at it 2 or 3 times, and then said, "We're taking it all with us. We're taking all of your data with us. And remember now that this meeting never happened. This never occurred. We weren't here."
But somebody did, because you're telling this story.
Yeah. So, James, I can't remember.
Well, the story the story actually reminded me of an X-Files episode. Part of it, when you're talking about the heat from the craft, there was this episode where a craft comes over, a mother and child camping in an RV, and the top of the RV is just baked. Yeah. I mean, do you think that there's some kind of microwave energy or maybe nuclear energy that's being used?
I don't know. You hear all these stories. Some of them are exactly alike, but then you've got these strange stories like you're talking about. So I don't know. You just you take the stories and you try to find pieces that fit, the stories that fit together and form part of a puzzle. Right. Some of the pieces simply don't fit, but anyway, James Callahan's who I was trying to think about, and he goes and he said, "I was told that this story never happened." So he goes to his office. He retires several months later. What he didn't tell these people was that he made copies of all of this stuff, the radar tapes and the everything that the CIA had. He had made copies of it. He said the people from the White House science office were very interested in it. And Callahan said, "Why are you so interested?" He said, "This is some of the best UFO data that we have." So he called it, UFO. And so Callahan said that he had these copies sitting on his credenza, figuring the FBI would come by and pick those up, figuring that he had copies. They never did. So when he retired, all that stuff was packed up and taken home. He put it all in his garage. There it sat for several years until the story sort of came out again. And he said to himself, "What the heck, I'll go public with it." And he did. And his excuse was, this is a story that I was told never happened, so I guess I can tell about it.
That's a good cover.
that was his excuse, and he stole the story. And I think it's one of the best UFO stories that we have. Certainly one of the best in the United States. Rendlesham Forest, Brentwood is in England is a fascinating story, but I think in this country this is really close to the top of the list.
All right, and if you're just tuning in, this is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. Our guest is Larry Holcombe, author of The Presidents and UFOs, A Secret History from FDR to Obama. You can follow Paranormal Now on Facebook at Paranormal Now or on Instagram at Paranormal Now. And what's a website that people can go to and check out your work, your writings?
My website is LarryHolcombe.com, www.LarryHolcombe, LarryHolcombe.com. And so I must confess, I do a terrible job of keeping it up to date. I don't know that I'll be going to Roswell in July again. I've been to Roswell to lecture since at the UFO festival they have every year. Since
I think you did actually, yeah.
But I do a terrible job. I've got to get a webmaster to take care of it for me because I just don't look after it. But there's a lot of information there.
Well, I grinned because that's exactly what you wrote on your website.
Okay.
My bad. I need a webmaster.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, you've garnered the respect and even friendship of people like Stan Friedman, and I wonder, and other researchers, what is it about yourself and the work that you're doing that garners that mutual respect?
Well, I think as far as Stan goes, he and I see pretty eye to eye to things. We're pretty much on the same page, and because of that, he has been a great help to me. We correspond. Back when I was writing the book, we corresponded with him a great deal on email, and then I see he and Kathy Marden every year in Roswell, so we chat there, and it's just that he's been a big help to me. And again, we see pretty much eye to eye on things.
Besides writing the foreword for the book, I mean, have you guys shared any information? Nick Pope, Kathleen, Stanton, any of those guys?
Well, yeah, of course, Nick Pope contributed to the book in his own words, which was very helpful. So did Kathleen Marden, Bob Salas, Robert Salas, who had the UFO sighting when he was a launch control officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base. He contributed to the book in his own words to clarify some things, and just have had. I've gotten a lot of input from a lot of people. Bob and Ryan Woods, who authenticate, are in the business of authenticating leaked UFO documents. Bob has been extremely helpful to me. So I've had a lot of help. Don Schmidt has helped me. Don got himself into a little bit of trouble with the.
That's right. Yeah, but Larry, I wanted to ask you too. The Bob Eminger's NBC TV documentary. Before we run out of time, I wanted to get you to explore and share some of your thoughts on that whole idea.
Well, yeah, that's a long story, and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. In doing research for my first book, I ran across this documentary called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. And it was an amazing documentary because it appeared to me to have the support of the government. You just don't walk into the Pentagon and have a former Air Force public information officer or a colonel walking the halls of the Pentagon with a film crew talking about UFOs and standing under a portrait of General Hoyt Vandenberg and discussing the famous estimate of the situation that the first flying saucer study group for the Air Force back in the early 40s wrote up and said their only conclusion they could come to was that they were extraterrestrial, and that was called the sent up to Hoyt Vandenberg, this famous estimate of the situation. And Vandenberg went ballistic and said, I can't go public with this, tell people that they're extraterrestrials visiting us, take this back and do something and rewrite it. And they did, but they were ruined. I think we were probably all sent off to Alaska somewhere because Project Sign that they worked under was abandoned and was replaced by Project Grudge, which was nothing but a propaganda group. But anyway, so here we have Major Colonel William Coleman walking the halls of the Pentagon talking about UFOs. Then you had Major Bob Friend, who ran Blue Book for a while, talking to the Korean helicopter crew that had a astounding UFO encounter over Mansfield, Ohio. And this goes on and on. The documentary was narrated by Rod Serling. And I said, this is, and there was no counterpoint. There was no counter argument about it. It was supporting the idea that UFOs were extraterrestrial. And I'm thinking, how can somebody do an NBC TV documentary like this with the help of the government when the government has been debunking it, in essence? So I found out that Bob Eminegger was the co-producer and writer of the thing. And I was able to contact him, and or tried to contact him. He actually called me back, and we talked initially for 2 hours. He gave me a lot of background on it, his involvement with the Nixon administration, the fact that he had been a fraternity brother of H.R. Bob Haldeman. Bob Haldeman knew of his work with Gray Advertising Agency in Los Angeles, a very well-known advertising agency. And the committee to re-elect the president wanted to do a documentary. So Bob was called in to ask him if they would do some sort of scientific documentary. A long story that they were sent all over the country to look at various programs and laser programs being conducted at Wright-Patterson. At the end...
But was this supposed to be an internal documentary, or was this actually meant for broadcast?
This is meant for broadcast. At the last, they were taken into Norton Air Force Base. The director of the film depository was located in Norton Air Force Base in California. The head of the base, Paul Chartle, the head of the film depository, got him into a clean room that was free of any listening devices and said, here's the deal. Would you people make a documentary on UFOs? And they were stunned. They never, Bob Eminegger told me, he said, I didn't know anything about UFOs except what my wife brought home on tabloids from the grocery store. And long and short, try to keep this. They said, yes, we would do it. They were sent to Washington, to Holloman Air Force Base, to Norton. I'm backing up. They were sent to Washington, to the Pentagon. When they got to the Pentagon, they were met by a couple of men and taken into a small room and started being browbeaten. They telling them, look, you guys don't need to want to get involved in this. You're getting into something that's very, very touchy, and you could get yourself into some real trouble. And I suggest you get on a plane and fly back to Los Angeles. Well, Paul Shartle, who was Bob Emenegger's partner in this effort, Sandler was a filmmaker, film producer, or had a film studio. And he said, as Bob told me, he said, Alan was no shrinking violent. And he looked him right in the face. He said, you give me a damn telephone. I'm tired of this foolishness. I'm going to call our contact at the White House. And he said at that point, the whole mood changed. And they were issued up to Colonel Coleman's office. Colonel Coleman sort of gave them the same deal. And then took him into his office, shut the door, and told him about his own UFO encounter when he was a pilot over southwestern United States. From there, they were sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to see Colonel George Weinbrenner, who was in charge of the Foreign Technology Division. And they were taken down in the catacombs, below ground catacombs, to Weinbrenner's office. And Bob said he walked right up to Weinbrenner's desk and said, Colonel Weinbrenner, is it true? And what I didn't say in the meeting with Paul Shartle was, Paul said, if you will take this job, we'll give you 600 feet of 16 millimeter movie film of an actual UFO landing at Holloman Air Force Base. Now, so he walks up to Colonel Coleman and says, Colonel, was there really a landing at Holloman Air Force Base of a UFO, and are you going to give us footage of that? He said, Coleman, or Weinbrenner got up from his desk and walked over to a blackboard and drew a picture of a fighter jet on it. He said, this is a MiG-21 or a MiG whatever. We don't know a damn thing about it, and they know everything about all of our aircraft. And he went on like that, discussing the MiG and this disparity between the two countries and what they knew. Walked over to a bookcase and took down a book. Walked over to Bob Emenegger, handed him, opened the front cover and handed it to him, and inscribed in the cover was, to my good friend George Weinbrenner, from Alan Hynek. The book was on UFOs. He took the book back away from Bob Emenegger, put it on the shelf, talked a little bit more, and issued him out the office, and never mentioned a word about UFOs, except for showing him that book. And then Emenegger and Sandler said that was their understanding that their question was being answered in the positive. And the long and short, they ended up real quick. They got money together from James D. MacArthur in Texas to do the documentary. They hired Jose Farrar, Burgess Meredith, and of course the Twilight Zone.
Sterling.
Yeah, Rod Serling. Mm-hmm. And to do the narration. When they were getting ready to start production, he got a call from their White House, Bill Carruthers and White House connection, and said, we can't give you the film. And Emenegger was stunned, and he said, why? He said, because Watergate is just broken, and it's getting hot, and the president is afraid that if he has this documentary made and releases it, then it's going to do him more harm than good. Now, keep in mind, Alan, Nixon, up until that time, was a very popular president. He was almost re-elected by a historic majority. So he was very popular and very powerful. He had opened relations with China. He had set up detente with the Russians. You can argue that the world was a safer place because of Richard Nixon, and he thought that if he in some way would disclose the existence of extraterrestrial life, it would just add to making him a great president, and a president that would go down in history.
And whatever backlash he got, he was buffered by his likability already.
Right. You have to remember that Nixon was close friends with Jackie Gleason, who was a strong believer in UFOs. who gave 1,600, when he died, his wife gave 1,600 volumes on UFOs and the paranormal to the University of Miami Library.
That's insane, yeah.
So you've got to believe that Gleason, who was incensed that the government wouldn't tell what they knew, playing golf with the President of the United States, you don't think that he bent his ear about disclosure? I'm positive that he did, that happened, and I think that could have played a role in Nixon's decision to disclose. And if it had not been for Watergate, we may be living in a very different world right now.
Well, so why not since then?
Why hadn't there been disclosure since then? Because I think that and I think it's been proven, and almost proven every day now, that there are a very small group in the intelligence community and in military industrial complex that keep this story under wraps for several reasons. I believe there were a lot of laws broken. I believe there could have been some serious crimes committed to keep the story under wraps. The primary reason to keep it under wraps, people say, well, it would destroy religion. The world economy would collapse. Well, there's some question that if we know how to create free energy, it would certainly put a big hurt on the economy initially, because oil is such an important part of our economy. But I think the primary reason is technology, that we have recovered these craft, and we have and continue to back engineer them, and we don't want to give the technology we have to other people. Consequently, that this, I think, is probably the most highly classified matter in the United States, and probably countries around the world that have their own encounters and feel the same thing. They don't want to divulge the secrets they know. They want to develop them for weapon systems or what have you. Can I prove that? No, but I think that it's completely logical and it makes sense.
Well, what would be the greatest revelation that you have had in your research?
I think the greatest revelation is the depth at which the government has been involved in the UFO, the flying saucer UFO story since 1947, and how involved they continue to be in it, and perhaps this is the greatest revelation, is that when Truman was deeply involved in the UFO issue, probably as much or more than any president. And I think he did set up an organization like Majestic 12 that had 6 high-ranking military officers and 6 very prominent scientists. And they were investigating the UFO flying saucer issue. And Truman said all of that will be controlled through the office of the president. And I think it was while Truman was in office. But I think once Eisenhower got into office, I think the intelligence community became involved in it. And Powell was slowly wrenched away from the executive branch into the government intelligence community, and therefore into the highest levels of the military-industrial complex. And make no mistake, the military-industrial complex is just as well, if not better, suited and capable in keeping these type of secrets than the intelligence community is.
All right, Larry Holcombe, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. You can find out more about Larry at larryholcombe.com. You can get his books, information, upcoming talks. Larry, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, Alan, it's been a pleasure. I enjoyed it. Give me a call. I'll be glad to come back.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. I'd like to thank MJ Lucas, Joe Champion, and Bob Tarmac. And of course, you can follow me at Paranormal Now on Instagram, at paranormal_now on Twitter and Paranormal Now on Facebook for more updates and information. I hope to see you guys there. Please join me. It's a great community already growing. And that's it. Again, live in the mystery. Take care, everyone.